continue with the elaboration of the socio-technical systems, and we shall continue looking at the impact which technical systems make on socio-technical systems, and together they make on the managerial system, and see the effect which they create on the efficiency and effectiveness of the whole process. This is to draw your attention to a simple truism. Individual and their relationships are the primary elements of this subsystem. Decision making is very often mortgaged to this. The relationship between individual relationships and relationships between the relationships, because there can be groups and each group may have its own system of relationships. The psychosocial systems can be understood in terms of motivation, behavior occurrence in an environment which includes the following. Please follow this very carefully, because this would give to you yet another dimension of understanding socio-technical systems. The operational life in India and elsewhere too gives huge emphasis on status and role systems. The reason why I emphasized India before I came to other parts of the world is India is a very status oriented society. Even corporate success has to be converted in the rise of the individual status of the person in the social segment from which he originates. So, very often his behavior in the managerial system is determined by his perceived understanding of what would be happening to his status in the social system in which he has originated. And this in turn serves to structure social relationships and provide a framework where group endeavors can coordinate towards objectives. Now, it is important in this context therefore, managerially to leverage status aspirations into designing of role systems. And how do you integrate status considerations in designing of role systems? Clearly, at this stage of the discussion, it is not possible to get into too many details, but one thing is obvious. Designations are very often synonymous with status. One of the commonest designations in the world of work today is the word director. There are directors in the corporate world. There are directors which are middle level officials. There are directors which are top of the rung executives and have membership of boards, and there are also directors of ad hoc teams, especially when it has to do with projects. There are directors in the governmental system. And in the governmental system, the rank director comes well below the rank of a joint secretary or an additional secretary, forget the secretary. There are directors in academic institutions, and in fact, in one case the institution was headed by a principal and the directors of the system reported to him. Therefore, status and role system serve to structure the social relationships and provide a framework for reference. It is not difficult therefore to see how the interactory relationship between status and role systems can work together. Status concerns the relative prestige of a position in a structural relationship within organizations. I will repeat that for you for the sake of better clarity. Status concerns the relative prestige of a position in a structural relationship within an organization, much the same way in which status concerns the relative prestige of an individual, a subgroup, the larger group in the larger social ambience. In fact, the role relates to behavioral patterns instead of given positions. So, role has to do with behavioral patterns rather than just given positions. In other words, if you conduct yourself in a particular way, you tend to be treated that way. It raises a whole set of complex issues which normally are very little understood when you are really handling socio-technical systems. The psychological subsystems have their own group dynamics, and listed below are 4 elements of group dynamics. Small groups provide a mediating mechanism between individuals and organizations. Very important to appreciate this, because unless you appreciate it, you will not be able to grasp the significance of interventions which sort out conflicts. Activities, interactions and sentiments play an important part in behavior in organizations. I hope you are noticing the listing of activities, interactions and sentiments. Individuals' higher level needs become a factor. What are individuals' higher level needs? Social esteem, self-actualization, I would like to conclude this discussion with drawing your attention to the power of communication in a socio-technical system which is based on group dynamics. Communication has a huge influence role. Through communication, group dynamics can be determined, and group dynamics becomes somewhat of an impact making factor on the canalization of work through organization structures. Group dynamics can include virtual or any interpersonal transaction which has psychological or behavioral effects. What is a virtual and interpersonal transaction in an organization? It has to do with emotional bonds which put together people. It has to do with relationship of give and take which may be rooted in social dynamics outside the work situation. Thus, it is that in organizations which are campus based, there is one kind of behavior at work, and in another organization which is not campus based, but really people assemble for work and disperse after work to their different social units, the managerial behavior has other tones. In the second case, influence may be exerted in many directions, up and down the hierarchy and laterally in peer groups. In campus based organizations, there will always be a greater consultative process based on a lot of sharing which has got nothing to do with the workplace. Changes in behavior of a person or group due to anticipation of the response of others has an effect on relationships amongst people. Therefore, to influence behavior, one has to practice emulation, attempt persuasion, and if I might add, where it requires, practice coercion. This leads us to one of the spin-offs of psychosocial subsystems, leadership, but after showing you a very quick slide on leadership, which I will urge you to read, I am going to skip any discussion on this, because a few sessions later I am going to come back to study of leadership as a topic in its own right. Let us move forward. The psychosocial subsystems however, has its human resources attitudes, and this would affect the way technology is operated. To give you a very simple example of how psychosocial subsystems affect HR attitudes, please remember the entire triggering off of the first war of independence on this country came between the ruling class and the ruled class because of a simple fallout of a technological characteristic which the social system was averse to. You would surely know what triggered off the mutiny, which converted itself into the first war of independence in 1857, where the story went that the bullet was laced with the fat of either the cow or the pig, and you were supposed to pull at the bullet to unsheath it with your teeth and your mouth before you could actually use that bullet. That was a technological characteristic. The bullet needed that kind of coverage, of that kind of fat, but the social norms did not accept it, and look at what happened. So, the psychosocial subsystem has its norms, values and culture. You cannot debate this rationally. Norms are really the behavior pattern which have emerged after years, decades, millennia of tested result oriented experimentation. These norms may be out of sync with the technological environment, but they are a reality. Values and culture are also offspring of time tested patterns. The relevance of raising it here is that norms, values, cultures create their own subsystems in an organization. This includes work relationships and common networks. Therefore, the psychosocial subsystem may have a reverse role on operations of technology. So, how people communicate and actually do the work strongly influences the organization through the psychosocial subsystem, and that is the significance of the psychosocial subsystem. This sentence is worth reading again. How people communicate and actually do the work strongly influences the organization through the psychosocial subsystems. Tavistock experiments, which we talked about, had a strong veneer of problems of workers who had problems in communication with the management, not because English was spoken differently, or the words that were used were in different meanings, but the values, norms, culture and the psychological and the social subsystems of the workers and management, and here workers is again for a change the blue collared individual, and management, which becomes the label for those who control the organization. When a person enters or leaves the organization, the social system often can and does change. Try to read this diagram on behavior. You have perception at the core of it, personal value systems, attitudes, propensities to act, then follows motivation, and then follows cognition. So, within the circle presumably of the domain of the organization, individuals will have their perception, individuals will have their motivation, and individuals will have their cognition. Cognition will be determined by group relationships. Work situation, task and technology along with culture norms will affect the organization, and these two arrows show that. Past experiences will come in and influence perception. Current personal situation will impact perception. And interestingly enough, it is argued that the reward system and the economic incentive will also impact perception. So, what would impact cognition? Managerial system, planning and control decisions, and leadership. These three will impact cognition. Work situation will impact motivation. Past experience will impact perception, and current personal situation will impact perception as much as the reward and the economic incentive system. Now, this is converting the psychosocial dimension into concepts which may be intangible concepts, but they are real concepts of the operational world and actually do determine decision making. A reminder again of the classical model of organizations, but we will not spend too much time on it. By now, you must have got used to this diagram. But let us take a quick look at the way the socio-technical systems, therefore, through its social system, the psychosocial system, and the technical subsystem impacts the management processes. We have discussed in the earlier presentations a proposition that management processes are really integrating human and material resources into a total system for objective accomplishment. Remember the discussion of managerial role and behavior, which put together the social and the organizational framework. This links with other primary systems of organizations, integrates activities towards achievement of explicit and implicit goals. Planning and control are the primary activities involved in integrating purposeful organizational activity. Planning and control have to consider the impact of external environmental systems and the internal technical and psychosocial systems. Behavior is goal oriented and human beings more towards goals by choosing an alternative. Behavior is a result of a sequence of decision making. Now, this is an important principle to register. Behavior is a result of sequence of decision making, a sequence of exercise of choices. Decision making is often the exercise of choices. The choices are determined by the socio-technical systems. So, back again to the organizational system, and again we need not spend too much time on this, because a constant reminder of the different variables of the 5 key labels is useful to put the whole discussion in perspective. I will walk you just through the labels again: goals and values of the subsystem, the technical subsystem, the structural subsystem, the psychosocial subsystem, and you have got the managerial subsystem. So, we now get into slightly deeper waters. The goals and values subsystem. The difficulty in dealing with topics like socio-technical systems, which are so pervasive that we tend to attribute to a power and an influence which is entirely unrealistic. Some people have the notion that socio-technical subsystem subsumes everything which happens in an organization. This is simply not true. It is goals and values under which the entire organizational system is subsumed. In fact, if you go back to the definition of an organization, it is a group of people brought together to fulfill a given set of objectives. If that be so, everything in an organization is subsumed under the concept of the goals, and being subsumed under the concept of the goals inevitably means that the value systems become important. The basic values which underlie goal setting and decision making are fundamental part of the organizational system, and let me repeat that for you for the sake of clearer understanding. Basic values which underline goal setting and decision making are fundamental parts of the organizational system. Normative views of what is good and desirable are one of the driving forces of organizational systems. They provide standards which influence choice of actions. Social values reflect a system, and these social values, when operationalized into decision making, acquire managerial values. It is here that the study of culture becomes important, and cultural values provide cohesiveness, provide a basis of interaction amongst people who do not know each other. Typically, how do you treat a profession? If somebody is a priest, how do you narrate to him? If somebody is a senior executive, how do you narrate yourself and your actions to him? if somebody is senior to you in age, how do you relate to him? And typically in India, why do you touch somebody's feet? Why do you in certain cases shake hands? Why do you in other occasions touch somebody's head as a blessing? These are cultural values which interestingly transcend caste, religion, region, and are available at a subcontinental level. In no part of India is a blessing given by touching of the shoulder or the nose. Blessing is always given by touching of the head. And if you think, isn't that the most normal thing to do? I am sorry, that is not the most normal thing to do. In another cultural paradigm, touching of the head is tantamount to insulting somebody, typically in Thailand. And with all the given commonalities of the culture which prevails in Thailand and the culture which prevails in India, symbolic gestures of touching of the head have two different connotations altogether. Thus it is that normative views of what is good and desirable is determined by a value system. That in turn provides standards which influence choices of actions. And you just heard me refer to social values and cultural values. These can run at very many levels. They can run at the group level, they can run at the individual level, they can run at the organizational level, they can run at the constituent level, and what is more, they can run at a level which has value for the total society in terms of its cultural dimension. Goals and value subsystems therefore have three primary perspectives. The primary perspectives are environmental, organizational, and individual. At the environmental level, the social goals imposed on the organization, because they come from the organization. For example, you go to Saudi Arabia, and at each prayer time, when the alert is sounded, work is supposed to stop, and it does stop. I am not going to get into nitty-gritty of what would happen in a process-oriented manufacturing unit, what would get to happen in an assembly line unit. You can clearly take it that there are ways of responding to it, but at an environmental level, the social goals impose upon the organization. Social goals of celebration, social goals of regret, social goals of recall of a hero, they all impose upon the organization. At an organizational level also, goals and values operate. Remember, I said there are three primary perspectives. The first is the environmental level, the second is the organizational level. At the organizational level, the system goals affect the functioning of an organization. And the third, and no prizes for guessing that, the third besides environmental level, organizational level, is the individual level. Goals influence the interactions between an environment and a supra system and the other system. They focus the attention of participants. Participants means those who are in the organization. Focus the attention of the participants upon actions which are organizationally relevant. They help to determine the technology required and they set the basis for specialization of effort, authority patterns, communication, and the decision networks and other structural relationships. Let me repeat that for you. They set the basis for specialization of effort. Yes, effort can be specialized. Authority patterns, communication and decision networks, and the other structural relationships. Therefore, the larger point being made is, for your consideration, socio-technical systems approach not only affects the working of the entire organization, giving it a framework of analysis and interpretation, but much more, it impacts the specific functions. These functions can be of authority patterns, communications, and more. A quick run through this slide will help you to catch up on some of the elements which determine the goal and value subsystem from the socio-technical dimensions point of view. They influence the goals. Of course, they do. We have discussed that. But what's more, they influence. One of their variables is personality of the top executive, the history of the organization, the community environment, norms and values with which the organization deals with, the cultural safety. So, basically speaking, systems goals, which is elaborated here, deals with self-perpetuation. Remember, one of the laws which says a body will continue to be in a state of motion or in a stable state unless etc., etc., etc. Now, staying in a state of motion or in a static state is a system characteristic. So, this is called self-perpetuation. Stability of operations, high rate of return, growth, satisfaction of participants, technical leadership, innovation. These become the systems goals which are held forth and which help to take an organization forward. Then there are the supra subsystems, that is the subsystems which transcend systems. Every organization has identifiable but permeable boundaries which separate them from their environment. They receive inputs across these boundaries and transform them into return outputs. Boundaries provide a degree of autonomy and independence for organizations from external influence. Selectively, it can be open to inputs, transformation and outputs as a filter. We are describing the supra subsystem. We shall move on to an analysis of the next subhead, which is autonomous work groups, which we were talking about earlier on in terms of integration and autonomy at different levels of organization. The socio-technical systems theory argues with some force, basically as a fallout of the Tavistock researches, that productivity and satisfaction can be pretty high in autonomous work groups. Therefore, the play is on the concept of autonomy, the limits of autonomy, and the contents and the limits of autonomy determine what kind of work organization or work effectiveness can be expected. Workers work as a team to complete an entire task vis-a-vis workers performing a particular chore along an assembly line. Two approaches help: team building and matrix organizations, and both these have been explained to you earlier on. So, we do not want to spend more time on autonomous work groups, but we want to talk of what many authorities have referred to and which we have agreed is an endemic factor of the functioning of organizations, that is the concept of uncertainty. And I had made some comments on the nature of uncertainty which exists in today's world, but the important thing to realize is that uncertainty is not a newborn phenomena, but uncertainty has been around long enough for very many serious researches to have been done on it, and two names which come to mind, and one of them you have already heard of, Burns and Stoker, another one is Lawrence and Loesch. And Burns and Stoker suggested two factors in determining of organization structure and performance: rate of change, which has to do with uncertainty, and level of uncertainty within the rate of change, but going beyond it, levels of uncertainty in the environment. Therefore, levels of uncertainty in the rate of change and levels of uncertainty in the environment, two types of systems were recommended. Lawrence and Loesch, however, specialized systems development as a factor of response to different aspects of organization environment. In other words, their whole specialization was in developing and identifying specialized systems which develop in response to different aspects of the organization environment. For example, production department, which has made stable environment conditions, tends to be more bureaucratic than research department. So, their contribution is, and their specialization is, having identified specialized systems which develop in response to different aspects, and they concluded illustratively that production departments which had a stable environment conditions will tend to be more bureaucratic than, say, research departments. Typically, relationship between size and level of bureaucratization will also stand, as has been already explained. Relationship between organization size and job satisfaction is a factor to keep in mind. Interestingly, there is a relationship according to some people on organizational size and unionization, and indeed organization size and strike proneness. We shall not spend too much time on that. To wrap up the discussion, therefore, there is the contingency theory as a model of change. We have spent some time discussing this when we are looking at the systems theory. Therefore, I will leave this here for a moment, but will not spend too much time explaining it, because this is basically by way of a conclusion and a recap. We have also discussed the formal and informal systems, and so finally, I draw your attention to what I call the 6-box model: the purpose, the relationships, the structure, the leadership, and helpful mechanisms, and the rewards. I will read you through it so that you can understand the concluding portion of the presentation through the 6-box model on socio-technical systems. Purpose: what business are we in? We are in the business of looking at management theory and practice of engineering business through the twin perspectives of organizations and human resources. Therefore, if you know what business we are in, we would have agreement on goals and mission. What is the relationship which we are in, which means asking the question, how do we manage conflict among people with technologies? In other words, we also look at how do workers get along. Then the third box is of structures. Structures, how do we assign the work and how does it get done? That is the question which structure answers. Leadership, does someone keep the boxes in balance? That is, leadership answers to an individual's role in an organization. Remember, we asked the purpose and we asked what business we are in. We asked a question on relationships and we asked how do we manage conflict amongst people with technologies. We asked how do workers get along. We asked a question on structures, which led us to ask how do we assign the work and how to get it done, how it gets done. And we were at a stage where we were looking at leadership, which basically is explained in terms of asking, does someone keep the boxes in balance? And finally, two conclusions: helpful mechanisms in running organizations. Have we adequate coordinating technologies like budgeting, planning and control and management information? Because helpful mechanisms in socio-technical systems will cover both the soft technologies and the hard technologies. And then we get to the rewards. Do all needed tasks have incentives? So, that is the question you ask on rewards. In simple terms, therefore, the socio-technical systems perspective, as elaborated, helps to put together a very large number of variables with reference to the working of organizations, the working of technologies, the working of people, the components of technology, the components of people, and in the ultimate analysis assist the cognitive system of people who organize the organization to look at the whole exercise, the whole operation, the whole entity in a way which gives them insights on what to do to keep it effective, what to do to keep renewing it, and what to do to keep making it grow, and that is the ultimate outcome of the socio-technical systems perspective.